The clock on the Stone Creek church tower struck 2 in the morning, when the silence was broken by a sound that sent shivers down the spines of even the most skeptical. A desperate, shrill, and persistent whinny echoed through the stone streets of the small West Virginia town. The cold winter wind carried that animal cry into homes like an omen that something important was about to happen. Mrs. Connie, who suffered from chronic insomnia, was the first to hear it. She got up with difficulty, adjusted her thick-framed glasses, and opened a crack in the window. The darkness of night didn't allow her to see much beyond the small garden of her house. "These irresponsible tourists bringing animals at this hour of the night," she grumbled, closing the window forcefully. Further down the street, Gerald, the baker, also heard it. Accustomed to waking up early to prepare bread, he was finishing organizing ingredients when the whinny made him freeze. "Something's wrong with that sound," he commented to the cat watching him from the corner of the kitchen. "It sounds like distress." But no one had enough courage to investigate. No one except Sarah Davis, 38 years old, a seamstress with skilled hands and a restless heart. Sitting in her rocking chair, she was sewing by the light of an old lamp when the whinny reached her ears. It wasn't just the animal's distress that disturbed her, but the feeling that the sound carried a message, a call. Sarah had lived alone since returning to her hometown 5 years ago. After a tumultuous divorce from Richard, she preferred the familiar comfort of Stone Creek, where she opened a small sewing studio. That simple and predictable life didn't seem to match her adventurous spirit, but for her, it was a way to rediscover her roots and heal the wounds her marriage had left. After hearing several consecutive whinnies, Sarah could no longer sit still. She put a coat over her nightgown, grabbed a powerful flashlight she kept in her dresser drawer, and went out into the deserted street. "Sarah, you're going crazy," she muttered to herself as she closed the door. "What will Teresa say if she sees you walking alone through town at this hour?" Teresa was her childhood best friend and the voice of reason in her life. She always advised her not to get into trouble, to follow a quiet and safe life. But there was something about that whinny that Sarah couldn't ignore. Following the sound, her steps led her beyond the main square where tourists usually gathered during the day. The uneven terrain of the town made the streets increasingly steep, and the dark path required extra attention. The whinny seemed to come from a specific location, a place many residents preferred to avoid. The old well built by the town's first inhabitants and abandoned for decades. When she finally arrived there, Sarah felt her heart race. A magnificent black horse with shiny coat and frightened eyes was circling around the well. Its front hooves scraped the ground forcefully, raising small clouds of dust. The animal seemed desperate, as if trying to communicate something of vital importance. "Easy, boy," Sarah said, approaching slowly with her hand extended. "What happened? Where did you come from?" The horse stopped whinnying when it saw her, its large, deep eyes fixed on her with an almost human intensity, making her shudder. For a moment, Sarah had the impression that those eyes had crossed with hers before in another time, perhaps even in another life. Cautiously, she pointed the flashlight into the well. The light illuminated only the damp stone walls and some dry leaves floating on the surface of the dark water, dozens of feet below. Nothing abnormal, at least at first glance. When she looked back at the horse, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Its hooves were covered with fresh earth, as if it had been digging vigorously before her arrival. The animal approached her, so close that Sarah could feel its warm breath. Then, unexpectedly, it whinnied once more and bolted into the darkness, disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. Alone again, Sarah illuminated the ground around the well. The earth was indeed disturbed at a specific point. Feeling a shiver run down her spine, she knelt and ran her fingers over the irregular surface. Something told her this wasn't a random occurrence. There was a mystery there, dormant beneath the soil of Stone Creek, and the black horse seemed determined to reveal it. The first rays of sunlight were already tinting the sky orange when Sarah finally managed to fall asleep. Her sleep was restless, populated by dreams where a black horse guided her through underground labyrinths, while a woman's voice whispered incomprehensible words in her ear. She woke with a start, when the clock marked only 9 in the morning. "I need to go back to that well," she murmured, rubbing her eyes swollen from insufficient sleep. After a quick coffee, Sarah, dressed in simple, practical clothes, while tying her brown hair in a loose bun, she observed her reflection in the mirror. Her delicate-featured face showed dark circles, witnesses to her agitated night. For a moment, she hesitated, questioning whether she should share her experience with someone. Teresa would probably think she was imagining things, as always happened when Sarah expressed her premonitions. "I'll investigate first, then decide if I tell anyone," she concluded, grabbing a small gardening shovel she kept in the back closet. The path to the well seemed different in daylight. Stone Creek was a town known for its mystics and supernatural stories, but Sarah always considered herself a down-to-earth person, despite her sharp intuition. As she climbed the trail leading to the well, she greeted some residents who looked at her curiously. "Going to plant something up there, Sarah?" asked Mr. Nelson, pointing to the shovel in her hand. "Just want to check a location for a possible herb garden," she lied, feeling her cheeks flush. She was never good at making up stories. Upon reaching the well, the first thing she noticed was the absence of the horse. The place was quiet, with only the gentle wind stirring the leaves of nearby trees. She approached the spot where she had seen the animal digging the night before. The soil remained disturbed, but something caught her attention. The hole seemed deeper, as if someone had continued digging after she left. Feeling a chill run down her spine, Sarah knelt and began to dig carefully with the shovel. After a few minutes, the tool hit something solid. With her fingers, she removed the rest of the soil to reveal a metallic object. When she finally pulled it to the surface, her heart accelerated. It was a golden bracelet, delicate and covered with dirt. Despite the dirt, one could clearly see a small symbol engraved in the metal, a crescent moon encircling a star. Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins as she recognized that jewelry. "It can't be," she whispered, cleaning the bracelet with the hem of her shirt. "This bracelet belongs to Rebecca." Rebecca Lewis had been a young literature teacher who had mysteriously disappeared from Stone Creek 8 years ago. At the time, Sarah had not yet returned to town, but she remembered well the case that had reverberated in regional newspapers. According to the news, the young woman had simply left a farewell letter and departed without saying where she was going. Some speculated that she had run away with a secret lover. Others said that work pressure had led her to seek a new life. Far from there. Sarah put the bracelet in her pocket and looked around, feeling watched. The wind was blowing stronger now, bringing with it a slight aroma of damp earth. With nothing more to do there, she decided to visit the only person in town who could confirm if that jewelry had indeed belonged to Rebecca. Mrs. Celeste, the former owner of the boarding house where the teacher had lived. Mrs. Celeste's house was in the oldest part of town, a simple stone construction with blue-painted wooden windows. The 75-year-old lady, with her white hair always tied in an impeccable bun, cultivated a small medicinal herb garden that she supplied to the local pharmacy. When she saw Sarah approaching with a worried expression, she immediately invited her in. "You look like you've seen a ghost, child," Celeste commented, serving chamomile tea without even asking if Sarah wanted any. "Mrs. Celeste, I need to show you something," said Sarah, taking the bracelet from her pocket. "Do you recognize this?" Upon seeing the jewelry, Celeste's face paled. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she took the bracelet. "Where did you find this?" she asked in a weak voice. "Near the old well. A horse was digging there last night, and this morning I went back to investigate." Celeste adjusted the reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck and examined the bracelet meticulously. This bracelet belonged to Rebecca Lewis. She never took it off, said it was an inheritance from her grandmother. When she disappeared, everyone thought it strange that the bracelet hadn't gone with her, but no one could find it among the belongings she left behind. "Do you think she really ran away, as they say?" questioned Sarah, carefully observing the elderly woman's reaction. Celeste sighed deeply before answering. "At the time, I didn't question the official version. The letter seemed authentic, and Rebecca was always a reserved young woman with few friends, but now finding this bracelet buried," she paused as if carefully considering her next words. Rebecca had a complicated relationship with Colonel Newman, for whom she gave private lessons to his daughter. She never spoke openly about it, but sometimes she came back from the lessons with red eyes, as if she had been crying. Colonel Richard Newman, the most influential man in town? Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. The colonel was known for his difficult temperament and the way he controlled virtually all important business in Stone Creek. The very same, confirmed Celeste, returning the bracelet. If Rebecca really fled, of her own free will, why would her most precious bracelet be buried near the well? The question hung in the air like a loaded cloud, a harbinger of an approaching storm. Sarah knew she had stumbled upon something much bigger than she had imagined. As she put the bracelet back in her pocket, a decision formed in her mind. She would return to the well that same night, hoping that the mysterious black horse would reappear. The day passed slowly for Sarah. Back at her studio, she tried to concentrate on the dresses she needed to deliver by the end of the week, but her thoughts kept returning to Rebecca's bracelet and the mysterious black horse. Her fingers, normally nimble and precise, made small mistakes that forced her to undo stitches and start over several times. "You have your head in the clouds today," commented Teresa, who had stopped by the studio to try on a dress. Tall and with a striking presence, Teresa Mitchell worked as the manager of the only medium-sized hotel in town and knew practically all the residents and their secrets. "I'm just tired," replied Sarah, avoiding her friend's perceptive gaze. "I didn't sleep well last night." "Are you sure that's all it is?" insisted Teresa, observing her through the mirror while Sarah adjusted the hem of the dress. "I've known that distant look of yours since we were children. You found something, didn't you?" For a moment, Sarah considered telling Teresa everything. However, something held her back. If her suspicions were correct, and Rebecca's disappearance had not been voluntary, she was dealing with a potentially dangerous secret involving powerful people. She didn't want to drag her friend into this. "It's just a personal project I'm developing," she changed the subject. "A special dress with elements of local culture." Teresa didn't seem convinced, but didn't insist. Before leaving, she cast a final worried look at her friend. "Just be careful, Sarah. This town hides more secrets than people imagine." Teresa's words echoed in Sarah's mind for the rest of the afternoon. When she closed the studio, it was already past 7 in the evening. The sky was exceptionally starry, without clouds to hide the glow of the crescent moon, ironically the same symbol engraved on Rebecca's bracelet. At home, Sarah prepared meticulously to return to the well. This time, besides the flashlight, she took a small camera, a canteen with water, and a notepad for notes. She dressed in dark clothes to not attract attention in case someone saw her, and tied her hair in a firm braid. Before leaving, she hesitated in front of the phone. Maybe she should tell someone where she would be. Her fingers hovered over the device for a few seconds, but she ended up giving up. "I'm being paranoid," she thought. "It's just a lost horse and an old bracelet." The path to the well seemed more sinister at night. The stone houses projected strange shadows under the moonlight, and the wind whispered among the trees like distant voices. When she finally reached the spot, there was no sign of the horse. Only the silence and the disturbing stillness that enveloped that isolated part of town. Sarah sat on a nearby rock and waited, the minutes dragging by with an almost painful slowness. An hour passed without anything happening. She was about to give up when she heard the soft sound of hooves on the earth. Turning quickly, she saw the majestic black horse emerging from the darkness, as if it had materialized from the shadows themselves. This time, there was something different about the animal. In the light of her flashlight, Sarah noticed a cut. On the left flank of the horse, a recent wound that still seemed wet. The animal approached slowly, its eyes fixed on her with that same disconcerting intensity as the night before. "What happened to you?" murmured Sarah, extending her hand cautiously. "Who did this?" The horse remained motionless, allowing her to examine the wound. It wasn't deep, but it seemed to have been made by something sharp, perhaps a fence, or, as a disturbing thought suggested, a knife. It looked like the kind of cut someone would make to forcibly drive the animal away from a place where they didn't want it. When Sarah gently touched the horse's neck, it whinnied softly and began to move away, turning to look at her, as if it wanted her to follow. "You want to show me something?" she asked, feeling slightly foolish for talking to an animal as if it could understand her. The horse whinnied again, more insistently this time, and began to walk toward a little used trail that extended beyond the well. Sarah hesitated for only an instant before following it, curiosity overcoming any fear. The trail wound through the dense vegetation, gradually moving away from the center of town. After about 20 minutes of walking, they came to a clearing where an old colonial-style house stood, partially hidden by tall trees and vines. Sarah recognized the place immediately. It was the old Montgomery property, a family that had left Stone Creek more than a decade ago. Since then, the house had remained abandoned, as it was said to bring bad luck to whoever inhabited it. The horse stopped in front of the house, its eyes fixed on the broken windows of the upper floor. Sarah approached cautiously. The main door was locked with a rusty padlock, but one of the side windows had completely broken glass, allowing entry. "You really want me to go in there?" she whispered, looking at the horse. In response, the animal stomped the ground 3 times in an almost human gesture of affirmation. Taking a deep breath, Sarah illuminated the interior of the house with her flashlight. Through the broken window, she could see old furniture covered by dusty sheets, pictures on the walls, and what most caught her attention, recent footprint marks on the dusty floor. Someone had been there recently, and judging by the pattern of footprints, not just one person but several, the smell of damp earth invaded her nostrils, mixed with something else, an acrid odor that reminded her of chemicals. Sarah looked again at the black horse, which remained motionless, observing her with those deep and enigmatic eyes. A sense of urgency took hold of her, as if each minute that passed was taking her further from the truth she was seeking. "I'll come back tomorrow in daylight," she promised the animal before moving away. "Thank you for bringing me here." As she walked back home under the starry sky, Sarah couldn't help but feel that she had taken the first step on a path of no return. Questions multiplied in her mind. Why had the horse led her to that abandoned house? What was the connection with Rebecca Lewis's disappearance? And most importantly, who had recently been in that supposedly abandoned property? She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the shadowy figure watching her from afar, partially hidden among the trees that lined the trail. Vigilant eyes that followed her every step, determined to keep buried secrets that Stone Creek had guarded for years. Morning light filtered through the curtain gaps when Sarah woke with a start. She had slept just a few hours, her sleep disturbed by nightmares where she ran through endless corridors in an old house, pursued by faceless shadows. The clock showed 7:30, an hour later than usual for opening the studio. She got up hurriedly, feeling her legs sore from the night walk. While preparing a strong coffee, she tried to organize her thoughts. The discovery of the bracelet, the wounded horse, the abandoned house with signs of recent visitation. Everything pointed to something much more complex than a simple voluntary disappearance. "I need to find out more about the relationship between Rebecca and Colonel Newman," she murmured to herself, watching the smoke rising from her cup. She decided she would open the studio later. First, she would visit the municipal library, where Rebecca had worked as a volunteer before her disappearance. With luck, someone could provide more information about the young teacher. When she opened the front door to leave, however, an object on the doormat caught her attention. It was a small white envelope, without a stamp or address, just her name written in block letters. With her heart racing, Sarah quickly looked both ways down the street before taking the envelope and going back inside. The paper was of good quality, thick and textured. Upon opening it, she found a note written in the same handwriting as the envelope. The message was short and direct. "Leave the past where it is." Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew she was investigating Rebecca's disappearance and wanted her to stop. She sat on the sofa trying to control her rapid breathing. In a small town like Stone Creek, news traveled fast, but not that fast. She had only told Mrs. Celeste about the bracelet, and she doubted the elderly woman had shared the information with anyone. Unless someone had seen her the night before, following the horse to the abandoned house. The feeling of being watched hadn't been just paranoia. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts and making her jump on the sofa. It was Teresa. "Sarah, are you okay? I passed by the studio and it was closed. It's not like you to be late." "I'm fine, I just overslept," she lied, looking again at the note. "I'll open in half an hour." "Are you sure? You sound nervous." "It's just fatigue, Teresa. We'll talk later." After hanging up, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't ignore the note, but she also wouldn't allow herself to be intimidated. If someone wanted to prevent her from discovering the truth, it was because there was something important to be found. She put the note in a drawer, changed clothes quickly, and headed for the studio, determined to maintain a normal routine while planning her next steps. The library would have to wait until the end of the workday. The day at the studio was busy. 3 clients came to pick up finished pieces, and a tourist ordered a dress inspired by local crafts for an event in New York. Despite the intense work, Sarah couldn't get the note and its implications out of her head. Around 4 in the afternoon, the doorbell announced the entry of someone who made Sarah momentarily freeze. Helen Newman, the Colonel's daughter, a woman in her early 30s with an aristocratic bearing and eyes as cold as ice. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Davis," greeted Helen, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've heard wonderful things about your work and I'd like to order a dress for my father's birthday next month." "Of course, Miss Newman," replied Sarah, trying to keep her voice steady. "What kind of dress do you have in mind?" As they discussed fabrics and styles, Sarah discreetly observed the woman in front of her. Helen had a contained manner, measuring each word and gesture with precision. At one point, her eyes wandered around the studio and stopped for a moment on the framed photograph on the wall. A portrait of Sarah, alongside Teresa and 2 other friends, taken at a town festival 2 years ago. "Have you known Teresa Mitchell for a long time?" asked Helen, seemingly casual. "Since childhood. We grew up together before I moved to New York." Helen nodded, a strange gleam in her eyes. "And I imagine you share everything. Secrets, discoveries." The tone wasn't of a question, but an affirmation. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a veiled threat in those words, a subtle warning. "We share what should be shared," she replied cautiously. "Some matters, however, I prefer to keep to myself." A thin smile appeared on Helen's well-drawn lips. Wise decision. In small towns, certain interests can be misinterpreted. She ran her fingers over the silk fabric that Sarah had suggested. People tend to meddle in matters that don't concern them and end up getting hurt. The air in the studio seemed to get denser, charged with tension. Helen set a date for the first fitting and left with the same elegant posture with which she had entered, leaving behind an expensive perfume and a not-so-subtle threat. As soon as the door closed, Sarah sat down, feeling her legs trembling. Now she was certain. Her interest in Rebecca's disappearance had reached the ears of the Newman family, and they clearly didn't want the subject to be unearthed. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but Helen's visit had reinforced her determination. Upon closing the studio, instead of heading to the library as planned, Sarah decided to go back to the abandoned house, this time in daylight. The property seemed less intimidating under the setting sun, but no less mysterious. The black horse wasn't in sight, but Sarah felt its presence as if the animal was watching from somewhere nearby. The broken window still offered an entrance, and after checking there was no one around, Sarah climbed up and passed into the interior of the house. The air was heavy with dust and humidity, making her sneeze. The footprints she had seen the night before were even more visible now, crossing the entrance hall in various directions. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, she explored the ground floor. In the main room, old furniture remained covered by yellowed sheets from time. On the shelves, dusty books awaited readers who would never come again. A photograph in a silver frame caught her attention. It showed a family on the porch of the house, father, mother, and a girl of approximately 10 years, all smiling at the camera. Upon lightly touching the frame, Sarah felt something loose on the back. Turning it over, she discovered that the velvet backing was partially unglued. Curious, she removed it completely, revealing a hidden object, an old key darkened by time with a partially faded name engraved on the metal, Neum. Sarah examined the key in her hand with a racing heart. Neum could only be a reference to Newman. What was the relationship between the Colonel's family and this abandoned house? Why would someone hide a key with this surname in a picture frame? She put the key in her pocket and continued her exploration. The kitchen still had some basic utensils, as if the former residents had left in a hurry, taking only the essentials. Upstairs, she found 3 bedrooms. The first seemed to have belonged to the couple, with a double bed and a large mahogany wardrobe. The second, smaller, had childish characteristics, faded wallpaper with star patterns and a small bed against the window. The third bedroom, however, was locked. Sarah tried to force the doorknob without success. Then, in a flash of intuition, she took the key she had found and tried to fit it in the lock. To her surprise, the key turned easily, as if the lock had been recently lubricated. The creaking of the door echoed down the silent corridor as Sarah pushed it slowly. Unlike the other rooms, this one wasn't covered in dust. Someone had been there recently, and more than once, judging by the state of preservation. It was a small office with a solid wood desk, bookshelves, and a worn leather sofa in the corner. On the desk, a folded newspaper caught her attention. The date in the header made her blood freeze. It was from just 3 weeks ago. Near the newspaper, an ashtray with cigarette butts confirmed that the place was used regularly. Sarah examined the books on the shelves, legal treatises, collections of classical literature, and some photo albums. When she pulled one of the albums, something fell to the floor, a yellowed envelope. Inside, she found newspaper clippings about Rebecca Lewis's disappearance, carefully organized in chronological order, along with handwritten notes in the margins. One of the notes made her heart race. Case closed, suicide confirmed, body not found. But no newspaper had ever reported a suicide. The official version had always been that Rebecca had departed voluntarily. Continuing her search, Sarah opened the desk drawers. In the last one, she found something that made her stomach turn, a small rectangle of fabric that seemed to have been cut from a dress. She immediately recognized the light blue floral pattern. It was identical to the dress that Rebecca wore in the only photograph Sarah had seen of her, displayed in the municipal library during a tribute to former employees. When she lifted the piece of fabric, she discovered something even more disturbing, a receipt for a large quantity of quicklime, dated 1 week after Rebecca's disappearance. The buyer's name had been covered with black ink, but the delivery address was visible: Newman Farm, 5 kilometers down the side road. A creak on the lower floor made Sarah freeze. Someone had entered the house. With her heart pounding, she quickly put the receipt and the piece of fabric in her pocket, along with the key. She closed the drawer carefully to avoid making noise and approached the door, trying to listen. Heavy footsteps slowly climbed the stairs. There was no time to leave through the corridor. Looking around, Sarah saw that the office window faced the back of the house, where a leafy tree extended its branches close to the windowsill. It was her only chance. She carefully opened the window, mentally thanking herself for having been athletic in her youth. By the time the footsteps reached the corridor, she was already outside, precariously holding on to a thick branch of the tree. With her heart in her throat, she saw the silhouette of a man enter the office. It was Otto, the foreman of the Newman farm, known for his blind loyalty to the Colonel. Sarah climbed down from the tree with difficulty, scratching her arms and tearing her blouse in the process. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she ran away from the house, keeping low to avoid being seen through the windows. She was almost reaching the main trail when she heard a familiar whinny. The black horse was waiting for her a few meters away, as if it knew she would need help. Without hesitation, Sarah approached, and in a maneuver that surprised even herself, managed to mount. The animal seemed to understand the urgency of the situation and bolted down the trail, taking an alternative path that led away from town. Sarah held onto the thick mane, feeling the wind on her face as they moved away from the abandoned house and the danger it represented. After a few minutes of intense gallop, the horse slowed its pace and stopped near a small stream that cut through the property. Sarah dismounted, her legs trembling from adrenaline and physical exertion. "Thank you," she whispered, caressing the animal's shiny neck. "Seems like we're in this together, aren't we?" The horse snorted softly, as if agreeing. Sarah sat by the stream, trying to organize her thoughts. What she had found in the abandoned house confirmed her suspicions. Rebecca's disappearance had not been voluntary, and the Newman family was somehow involved. The quicklime receipt was particularly disturbing. Lime was frequently used to mask odors and accelerate decomposition. A chill ran down her spine when she thought of the implications. She looked at the horse, which drank quietly from the stream. "Who are you?" she asked, more to herself than to the animal. "How do you know so much about all this?" At that moment, something in the horse's posture, in the way its deep brown eyes watched her, provoked an absurd idea in her mind. She remembered old stories her grandmother used to tell about souls that couldn't rest and returned in different forms to seek justice. "Rebecca?" she whispered, feeling foolish immediately after uttering the name. The horse raised its head abruptly, its ears moving forward with intensity, as if the name had awakened something in it. For an instant, Sarah almost believed her crazy theory might have some foundation. But there was no time for mystical musings. Night was approaching, and she needed to return to town before her absence was noticed. Besides, the documents she carried in her pocket needed to be stored safely. "I'm going to find out what happened to Rebecca," she promised the horse before departing, following the trail on foot that led back to town. No matter who's involved. Night had already fallen when Sarah finally arrived home, exhausted and shaken by the day's discoveries. She locked the door carefully, checking the locks twice, and closed all the curtains. The feeling of being watched hadn't left her since she'd left the abandoned house. She sat at the kitchen table and spread out the items she had brought, the key with the partial name Noom, filed the quicklime receipt, and the small piece of fabric from Rebecca's dress. Together, these pieces were beginning to form a dark puzzle, but important connections were still missing. The phone rang, making her jump with fright. It was Teresa. "Sarah, where have you been? I stopped by the studio after 6 and it was already closed." "I had to leave earlier to take care of some personal matters," replied Sarah, hating having to lie to her friend. "You've been strange these last few days." Teresa's voice was heavy with concern. "And it's not just that. Helen Newman was at the hotel today asking about you. She wanted to know how long you've been back in town, if you maintain contact with people in New York, that sort of thing." Sarah felt a chill. "What did you tell her?" "Just the basics. That you came back after the divorce and that you rarely talk about your life in New York." Teresa paused. "Sarah, are you mixed up in some problem? You know it's not safe to get involved with the Newmans, right?" "I'm not mixed up in anything, Teresa," she lied again, feeling a lump in her throat. "Probably Helen is just curious because she ordered a dress from me." "Just be careful, please." Teresa's tone made it clear she wasn't entirely convinced. After hanging up, Sarah decided she needed to hide the items she had found. Not at home where they could be easily discovered if someone decided to make a visit during her absence. She thought of the studio, but that would be risky too. She then remembered a perfect hiding place, the loose floorboard under the old sewing machine she had inherited from her grandmother. It was a heavy Singer, which she rarely moved, and the floor underneath it had a loose board that only she knew about. She placed the objects in an envelope, wrapped it in plastic to protect from moisture, and put it in her bag to take to the studio the next morning. She tried to sleep, but tossed in bed for hours, her mind reliving the day's events. When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of Rebecca, a young woman she had never met, but whose face she had seen in old photographs. In the dream, Rebecca rode the black horse, her eyes full of urgency as she tried to say something that Sarah couldn't understand. She woke with a start to the shrill sound of the alarm clock. After a quick coffee, she headed to the studio, determined to maintain a normal routine while continuing her discreet investigation. The morning went by, without incident, with 2 clients coming for fittings and an order for curtains from the local inn. Around noon, when she was alone in the studio, Sarah finally managed to hide the objects under the loose floorboard. It was when she removed the sewing machine that she noticed something strange. The dust on the floor had a different pattern, as if the machine had been moved recently and placed back slightly misaligned. Her heart accelerated. She was absolutely certain that she hadn't moved the machine in the last few days. She knelt and examined the loose board. At first glance, it seemed intact, but when she lifted it, she realized that the small storage space she maintained there, with old documents and some family jewelry, was more organized than she remembered leaving it. Someone had been there going through her things. A chill ran down her spine. Whoever it was knew exactly where to look. Fortunately, the items related to Rebecca were still with her, but this meant that her hiding place was no longer safe. As she was replacing the board, something caught her attention. A piece of fabric rolled up at the bottom of the hiding place that she didn't remember putting there. When she pulled it out, she discovered it was an old dress, carefully folded. A light blue dress with a floral pattern, the same pattern as the piece she had found in the abandoned house. With trembling hands, she unfolded the dress. It was of a simple and elegant style, suitable for a young teacher. In the inner pocket, she found something that made her heart momentarily stop. Pieces of paper carefully folded and hidden in the seam. Sarah took a few minutes to extract the papers without tearing them. They were pages torn from a diary, written in a delicate and precise handwriting. The first words already made clear to whom they belonged. March 15th. Today marks 3 months since I began teaching Clara Newman. The girl is brilliant and receptive, but every time I visit the Newman mansion, I feel a growing discomfort. The Colonel observes me in a way that makes me want to disappear. Sarah continued reading, her heart accelerating with each paragraph. Rebecca's diary revealed increasing harassment by Colonel Newman, requests for private meetings, expensive gifts refused, and finally veiled threats when she mentioned that she would stop teaching Clara. The last entry was particularly disturbing. May 12th. I can't take it anymore. Today he said that if I didn't give in, he would ensure I never worked as a teacher anywhere again. He said he has influential friends throughout the state. He mentioned that he knows about my past in Golden Ridge, about the incident at college. How could he know? No one here knows about that. I'm scared. I thought about running away, but I realized there's nowhere to go. He would find me. Maybe I should confront him, record our conversation somehow. The entry ended abruptly. 2 weeks later, Rebecca had disappeared. Sarah kept the diary pages with the other items in the plastic envelope, her mind working furiously. What had happened in those 2 weeks? Had Rebecca confronted the Colonel as planned? And what incident in Golden Ridge was it that the Colonel had used to blackmail her? The doorbell snapped her out of her thoughts. It was Mrs. Celeste, the former owner of the boarding house where Rebecca had lived. The elderly woman seemed agitated, her anxious eyes scanning the studio as if looking for something or someone. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said in a low voice, approaching. "It's about that bracelet you found, and about the black horse that has been seen around town." Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins. How did Mrs. Celeste know about the horse? The elderly woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca had a black horse named Perseus. It was her pet, kept in a small stable behind the boarding house. The night she disappeared, the horse also vanished. Everyone thought she had taken it, but..." Celeste paused, hesitant. "But," Sarah encouraged, barely able to breathe, "but the horse couldn't have gone with her. Perseus had been injured days before, a deep cut on his flank. The vet said he couldn't be ridden for at least 2 weeks." Celeste's eyes filled with tears. "And there's one more thing I never told anyone. The morning after her disappearance, I found stains that looked like blood in the corridor that led to Rebecca's room. When the sheriff came, the stains had already been cleaned." A heavy silence hung in the studio after Mrs. Celeste's revelation. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach as she tried to process the information. "Why did you never tell this before?" she finally asked, observing the wrinkled face of the elderly woman, which now seemed to carry the weight of years of guilt. Celeste sighed, pressing her worn leather purse against her chest. "Fear, my child. The sheriff at the time was a second cousin of Colonel Newman. When I mentioned the stains, he looked at me in a way—" She shuddered at the memory. "He said I was imagining things that Rebecca had left of her own free will and left a letter. When I insisted, he implied there could be consequences for elderly ladies who spread baseless rumors." Sarah offered a chair to Mrs. Celeste, who seemed about to faint with the weight of memories. "And about the horse?" she questioned, serving a glass of water to the lady. "Perseus was always special. Rebecca said he had an almost human intelligence." Celeste took a sip of water before continuing. "He disappeared the same night she did, but as I said, he was too injured for a journey. A few days later, they found his tracks in the forest, but never the animal itself, until now, from what they tell me." "And you think it's the same horse, after so many years?" Celeste shrugged. "Horses can live 20, 30 years with proper care. But it's not just that." Her eyes fixed on Sarah with disconcerting intensity. "They say he appears only to certain people, always at night and always near the old well or the Montgomery house." A chill ran down Sarah's spine when she heard the mention of the abandoned house. "The Montgomery house? What does it have to do with all this?" The Montgomerys were distant relatives of the Newmans. The matriarch, Mrs. Eliza, was Colonel Richard's aunt. When the couple died in a car accident, the property passed to the Colonel, but he never wanted to live there. He said the house brought bad luck. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The key with the partial name Neum, the well-maintained office in a supposedly abandoned house, the family photo she had found in the picture frame. "Mrs. Celeste, do you know if Rebecca and the Colonel met in that house?" The elderly woman shook her head. "I don't know for sure, but Rebecca mentioned once that she gave extra lessons to Clara at a more remote property, because the girl concentrated better away from the main mansion. She never specified where." Sarah decided to share her discoveries with Mrs. Celeste. She showed the bracelet, the diary pages, the dress fabric, and the quicklime receipt. With each item revealed, the elderly woman's face paled more. "My God! Then my suspicions were right," she whispered, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. "She didn't run away. She never ran away. The problem is that we don't have concrete evidence, just circumstantial evidence." Sarah put the items away again. "And if what I discovered about the Colonel is true, he wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens to expose his secrets, like he did with Rebecca." Celeste's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah nodded gravely. "We need help, someone who can guide us on how to proceed with this information." "I know someone," said Celeste, after a few moments of reflection. "Michael Santana, an investigative journalist from the state newspaper. He's already tried to investigate the Colonel's shady business before, but always ran into blocks. Maybe with this evidence. Do you know how to contact him?" "He's my friend Lorna's nephew. I can arrange a discreet meeting." They arranged that Celeste would make contact that very day and would schedule a meeting for the following night at her house, under the pretext of a church prayer group meeting. It was a perfect alibi since the group actually met weekly. After Mrs. Celeste left, Sarah felt for the first time in days a glimpse of hope. She was no longer alone in this investigation. Evening was falling when she decided to close the studio early and return home. Walking through the stone streets, she again felt that uncomfortable sensation of being followed. She turned around several times, but saw no one suspicious. As she turned the corner of her street, she almost collided with a tall, elegant figure, Helen Newman. "Mrs. Davis, what a pleasant coincidence," said Helen with a cold smile. "I was thinking of stopping by your studio tomorrow to talk about the dress. Of course, I'll be at your disposal," replied Sarah, trying to keep her voice steady. Helen studied her for a moment, her calculating eyes scanning Sarah's face as if looking for signs of something specific. "I heard you acquired a sudden interest in local history, particularly events from 8 years ago." Her tone was casual, but there was a veiled threat in her words. "I've always been interested in the history of Stone Creek," Sarah replied cautiously. "It helps in creating pieces inspired by local culture." "I see." Helen tilted her head slightly. But some stories are better left in the past, don't you agree? Especially when they've already been resolved. Before Sarah could respond, a black, shiny car stopped beside them. The driver, a burly man with a severe expression, whom Sarah, recognized as security for the Newman family, lowered the window. "Miss Helen, your father is asking for you. The meeting with the investors starts in half an hour." Helen waved slightly to the driver before turning her attention back to Sarah. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Davis. I hope you enjoy your walk. The streets of Stone Creek can be treacherous for those who don't know the way well." With a final icy smile, she got into the car, which then departed. Sarah remained motionless for a few moments, feeling her heart pound against her chest. There was no longer any doubt that she was being watched, and that the Newmans knew of her interest in Rebecca's case. Arriving home, she locked all the doors and checked each room meticulously. While preparing a tea to calm her nerves, she heard a sound coming from the kitchen window, a light scratch as if someone was trying to get her attention. She approached cautiously, slightly parting the curtain. To her surprise, in the small backyard was the black horse. The animal was watching her with those deep, intelligent eyes, apparently waiting for something. Hesitantly, Sarah unlocked the back door and went out. The horse didn't move, allowing her to approach. "What do you want to show me this time?" she whispered, lightly touching the animal's silky neck. In response, the horse stomped the ground with its front hoof in a rhythmic, almost deliberate manner. The movement reminded Sarah of something her grandmother used to tell, old stories about animals that guided people to buried treasures or hidden secrets. "You want me to dig here?" she asked, pointing to the spot where the horse was stomping with its hoof. The animal whinnied softly, as if confirming. Looking around to make sure she wasn't being observed, Sarah grabbed a small garden shovel from the tool shed and began to dig. The soil was moist and soft, making the work easier. After a few minutes of digging, the shovel hit something solid. With her hands, Sarah removed more earth to reveal a small metal chest the size of a shoebox, buried approximately a foot deep. The lock was rusty, but it yielded easily when forced with the tip of the shovel. Upon opening the lid, Sarah found a set of objects carefully wrapped in protective fabric. An old camera, a leather-bound notebook, a bunch of keys, and a sealed envelope with the name Perseus handwritten on the front. The horse whinnied again, agitating slightly when Sarah picked up the envelope. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and removed a single sheet of paper. It was a letter, and the first lines made her heart stop for an instant. "If you are reading this, it is because something has happened to me. My name is Rebecca Lewis, and I have reason to believe that my life is in danger." Sarah finished reading the letter with tears in her eyes and a renewed determination. The date at the end of the document was just 3 days before Rebecca's disappearance. There was no longer any doubt. The teacher had not run away. She had been silenced for daring to confront the most powerful man in town. She examined the rest of the contents of the chest, especially the film roll in the camera. She would need to find a way to develop it without raising suspicions. The cassette tapes contained recordings of conversations, but Sarah didn't have a device to play them. She would have to ask for help from someone she trusted. A soft whinny made her look out the window. Perseus was still there, his intelligent eyes fixed on the house as if standing guard. The animal's presence confirmed all her theories. If Rebecca's horse was alive and seemed determined to expose the truth about its owner, then the letter told the truth. It hadn't been just any horse that had led her to the clues. It had been Perseus, Rebecca's faithful companion, fulfilling a last mission for his owner. "I will bring justice, Rebecca," she promised aloud, as if the teacher could hear her, no matter how much time has passed. Carefully, she put the items back in the chest, except for the letter and the notebook, which she intended to show the journalist the next day. She needed to find a new hiding place, as neither her house nor the studio was safe anymore. After considering several options, she decided to take the chest to the only place where she was sure no one from the Newman family would look, the small storage room at the back of the main church, where they kept Christmas decorations and other seasonal items. As an active member of the parish, she had access to the key. She waited until the night was more advanced before discreetly leaving through the back, carrying the chest in a large bag. Perseus had disappeared, but she felt his presence in the shadows, watching, protecting. Back at home, almost midnight, Sarah was exhausted but more determined than ever. Tomorrow would be a crucial day. The meeting with journalist Michael Santana could be the turning point in this story. With trembling hands, Sarah quickly entered the house carrying the chest and its precious contents. The black horse, Perseus she was now certain, remained in the garden like a silent guardian as she closed and locked the back door. In the safety of her living room, she sat on the sofa and examined the items one by one before picking up the letter. The camera was an old Olympus, the kind that used 35mm film. The leather notebook contained detailed notes of meetings, conversations, and threats, all dated and chronologically organized. The bunch of keys had 5 different keys, each with a small identification tag: Montgomery House, Office, Cabinet, Chest 2, and Storage. Finally, she unfolded Rebecca's letter. The handwriting was the same as the diary pages, delicate, precise, with slight inclinations in the capital letters. She took a deep breath and began to read. "If you are reading this, it is because something has happened to me. My name is Rebecca Lewis, and I have reason to believe that my life is in danger. In recent months, I have been harassed and threatened by Colonel Richard Newman, a powerful man in this town. What started as innuendos and inappropriate invitations evolved into explicit threats when I began to reject his advances. He discovered about an incident from my past in Golden Ridge, a mistake made in my youth for which I have already paid, but which could ruin my reputation as a teacher if it came to light. The colonel gave me an ultimatum 3 days ago. Either I yield to his desires or he will destroy my career and ensure I never work as an educator anywhere again. I tried to record one of our conversations as evidence, but he discovered and became furious. Last night, upon returning from the Montgomery House, where I give private lessons to Clara, I realized I was being followed. I managed to shake off my pursuer, but I'm sure it was Otto, the colonel's foreman. I believe my time is running out. I have gathered in this chest all the evidence I could collect: photos, cassette, tape recordings, notes with dates and descriptions of each incident. In the camera, there are images I secretly took of a meeting at the Newman farm, where the colonel and his associates were discussing what appeared to be illicit business involving embezzlement of public funds and land grabbing. If you found this chest, you were probably guided here by Perseus, my dear horse. He has always had a special, almost supernatural sensitivity. Since I rescued him from mistreatment 3 years ago, we have developed a connection that many would consider impossible between human and animal. I leave all this in the hands of fate, hoping that if something happens to me, the truth will come to light. Not just about my situation, but about the crimes that Colonel Newman has been committing for years under the mantle of his respectability and power. Whoever you are, be careful. The Colonel's reach and influence extend far beyond the borders of Stone Creek. With hope that justice will prevail. Rebecca Lewis, May 10. The next morning brought with it an almost palpable tension. Sarah woke before sunrise, after an agitated night of confused dreams, where Rebecca and the black horse intertwined in fragmented scenes. She prepared meticulously for the day, aware that every movement could be observed. At the studio, she tried to maintain a normal routine, receiving clients and working on her projects with apparent tranquility. Inside, however, her heart raced every time the doorbell announced a new arrival. Around 11 in the morning, Teresa appeared, her face contorted in an expression of genuine concern. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said in a low voice, approaching the counter where Sarah was organizing fabric scraps. In private, Sarah led her friend to the back of the studio, a small room where she kept her drawings and projects in development. Teresa closed the door behind her before speaking. Helen Newman came to the hotel again this morning. She was with her father. The Colonel's name made Sarah feel a chill run down her spine. What did they want? They asked questions about you, many questions. Teresa seemed genuinely frightened. They wanted to know about your recent activities. if you've been going out at night, if you've received visits from outside town. What did you say? Just that you're reserved and focused on your work. Teresa hesitated before continuing. But the way the Colonel smiled when I mentioned that you've frequently been closing the studio early in the last few days, Sarah, he knows something. A knot formed in Sarah's throat. The Newmans were closing in, trying to intimidate her through those closest to her. Teresa, I need to tell you something, but you need to promise me you won't get directly involved. For the next half hour, Sarah related her discoveries, from the encounter with the black horse to the letter and Rebecca's objects. She only omitted the location where she had hidden the chest to protect her friend from any accusation of complicity. Teresa listened in silence, her face going from initial incredulity to horrified understanding. My God, Sarah, this is much bigger and more dangerous than I imagined, she finally said. We need to take this to the authorities. What authorities? The sheriff is the Colonel's cousin, the mayor is his political ally, and the county judge dines at his house. Twice a month, Sarah shook her head. Our best chance is this journalist, Michael Santana. If we can get him to publish the story in a state newspaper with all the evidence. Teresa didn't seem convinced. What if he's involved too? What if it's a trap? The question made Sarah hesitate. She hadn't considered that possibility. Mrs. Celeste trusts him, says he's already tried to expose the Colonel's shady business before. Even so, don't go alone. Teresa held her friend's hands tightly. I'll go with you. No, Teresa, it's too dangerous if something happens to me. Exactly why I won't let you face this alone, interrupted Teresa firmly. We've been friends for almost 3 decades. Do you really think I'm going to abandon you now? Sarah felt tears in her eyes, moved by her friend's loyalty. She finally agreed, and they arranged that Teresa would meet her at Mrs. Celeste's house an hour before the scheduled meeting with the journalist. The rest of the day passed slowly. At 5 in the afternoon, Sarah closed the studio and headed home, more aware than ever of the shadows that seemed to accompany her. Upon arrival, she found another envelope on her doorstep. This time the message was even more direct. Last chance. Abandon this search or suffer the consequences. Instead of frightening her, the threat fueled her determination. She changed clothes, put Rebecca's letter and the notebook in a discreet folder, and left through the back door, taking an alternative path to Mrs. Celeste's house. The night was exceptionally dark, with heavy clouds hiding the moon and stars. A cold wind blew between the stone houses, carrying the perfume of night flowers that spread through the town's gardens. As she turned a corner, Sarah almost collided with a tall figure that emerged from the shadows. Watch where you're going. Mrs. Davis, said Otto's deep voice, the Colonel's foreman. His angular face displayed a malicious smile in the weak light of the lamppost. The streets can be dangerous for those who go out alone at night. Sarah felt her heart accelerate, but maintained her composure. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Otto, but I know the way well. She tried to continue on, but the man moved to block her path. The Colonel would like to talk to you. Now. I'm sorry, but I have an appointment, replied Sarah, trying to get around him. Otto grabbed her arm with enough force to hurt. It wasn't an invitation, Mrs. Davis, and I suggest you come without making a scene. Before Sarah could react, the sound of hooves on the pavement made them turn their heads. Perseus was galloping toward them, furious whinnies cutting through the silence of the night. Otto immediately let go of Sarah's arm, his face contorting into an expression of terror. That damn animal again, he exclaimed, backing up a few steps. Taking advantage of the distraction, Sarah ran in the opposite direction, while Perseus reared threateningly before the foreman. The last glimpse she had was of Otto pulling something from his coat, possibly a weapon, before turning the corner and losing sight of both. Breathless and with her heart in her throat, she arrived at Mrs. Celeste's house through the back. Entrance as arranged, Teresa was already there, as was a middle-aged man whom Sarah assumed to be Michael Santana. Mrs. Celeste quickly closed the door behind her. My child, you're pale. What happened? Asked the elderly woman, leading her to a chair. Between broken breaths, Sarah related the encounter with Otto and Perseus's unexpected intervention. Michael Santana listened attentively, his face expressing a mixture of concern and professional interest. "They're desperate," said the journalist when she finished, "which means we're on the right track." Michael was exactly as Mrs. Celeste had described him, a man of principles with perceptive eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. After formal introductions, Sarah gave him the folder with Rebecca's letter and the notebook. "This is just part of what I found. There's more. A camera with undeveloped film, cassette tapes, and other documents that I've hidden in a secure location." The journalist examined the material with meticulous attention, occasionally asking questions to clarify details. After almost an hour, he closed the notebook and looked directly at Sarah. "This is pure dynamite, Mrs. Davis. Rebecca Lewis not only documented the harassment she suffered, but apparently discovered corruption schemes involving public contracts, illegal appropriation of indigenous lands, and even possible money laundering." He paused, thoughtful. "If we can develop these films and listen to these tapes, we'll have enough not just for a report, but for a serious criminal case." "How long would it take to publish this?" asked Teresa, who had remained silent until then. "Normally, several weeks to verify each piece of information, interview possible witnesses." Michael noticed Sarah's expression and quickly added, "But we can speed up the process. With the material I have here, I can prepare a preliminary version in a few days. Enough to draw the attention of state and federal authorities, who aren't under the colonel's influence." The sound of breaking glass in the next room interrupted the conversation. Mrs. Celeste got up to check, but before she reached the door, it was violently opened. 3 armed men invaded the room, followed by a figure that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. Colonel Richard Newman himself. Tall, imposing, and with a smile of superiority on his well-shaven face, the colonel wore an impeccable suit that contrasted with the brutality of his companions. His cold eyes surveyed the room before fixing on Sarah. "Mrs. Davis, what a disappointment. I tried to be reasonable, gave you several opportunities to abandon this useless obsession." His voice was soft, almost gentle, making his words even more threatening. "Now I see we need to adopt more definitive measures." One of the men grabbed the folder from Michael's hands, while another kept a gun pointed at the group. The colonel approached slowly, taking Rebecca's letter and examining it with apparent interest. "Interesting. I thought we had found all the little mementos that Rebecca left behind." He carefully folded the paper and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket. "Apparently her animal was smarter than we thought." "How did you know we would be here?" asked Sarah, trying to buy time while her brain desperately sought a way out. The colonel laughed, a humorless sound that seemed to chill the atmosphere. "Stone Creek is my town, Mrs. Davis. Nothing happens here without me knowing." He turned to Teresa with a significant look. "Some people should be more careful who they trust." Sarah looked at her friend, confusion and betrayal mixing in her chest. Teresa didn't meet her gaze, fixing her eyes on the floor. "Teresa," whispered Sarah, her voice choked. "You—" "She had no choice," interrupted the colonel. "Everyone has a price or a weak point. In Miss Mitchell's case, it was the hotel debt. It's surprising how a simple bank loan can be transferred to less understanding creditors." The silence in the room was as dense as winter fog. Sarah felt each beat of her heart as she stared into the cold eyes of Colonel Newman. To her right, Michael Santana remained tense but alert, his eyes subtly moving around the room, calculating possibilities. Mrs. Celeste had been forced to sit, her expression divided between fear and a silent dignity that decades of life had granted her. And Teresa, Sarah still couldn't fully process the betrayal of her childhood friend. "What do you intend to do with us?" she finally asked, breaking the oppressive silence. The colonel smiled, that calculated smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Always direct, aren't you, Mrs. Davis?" He adjusted the gold watch on his wrist, a casual gesture that contrasted with the tension of the moment. "Unfortunately, you've put me in a delicate position. I can't simply let you leave here with the knowledge you possess." "If something happens to us, people will notice," intervened Michael, his voice firm despite the circumstances. "My editor knows I'm investigating you, Newman." The colonel laughed, a humorless sound. Your editor? The same one who shelved your last 3 attempts to expose my business. He shook his head with false compassion. You really believed you got this far on your own merit, Santana. I allowed you to follow your little investigations, keeping you under observation. Until now. Sarah felt a chill. The Colonel's web of influence was even more extensive than she had imagined. At that moment, one of the henchmen approached the Colonel and whispered something in his ear. The man's confident expression momentarily faltered. Impossible. Check again, he ordered the henchman, who quickly left the room. Taking advantage of the distraction, Sarah exchanged a significant look with Michael. The journalist nodded, almost imperceptibly, understanding the silent message. You still haven't answered my question, Colonel, said Sarah, raising her voice to draw attention back to herself. What do you intend to do? Eliminate all of us like you did with Rebecca? The teacher's name seemed to hit the Colonel like a physical blow. His face hardened, his lips compressing into a thin line. Rebecca Lewis made foolish choices, he replied in an icy tone. Just as you are doing now. She chose not to give in to your harassment. She chose to maintain her dignity. She chose to confront you. Sarah stepped forward, ignoring the gun that the henchman pointed in her direction. And you couldn't stand being rejected, could you? The great Colonel Newman, accustomed to having everything he wants, couldn't accept a no from a simple teacher. The Colonel's face contorted in fury. She was insignificant, a nobody who dared to threaten everything I built. The control he had maintained until then began to disintegrate. She thought she could blackmail me with those photos, those recordings. I had to protect my family, my business. Protect, questioned Michael, joining Sarah in the strategy of provocation. Or protect yourself? How many lives have you already destroyed to maintain your empire of corruption, Newman? The Colonel took a threatening step toward the journalist, but was interrupted by the hasty return of the henchman. Sir, we have a problem. The man's voice trembled slightly. The federal police are surrounding the house. Dozens of them. The news fell like a bomb in the room. The Colonel paled, his confident expression crumbling for the first time. Impossible, he murmured, more to himself than to others. How did they... A deafening noise of breaking glass came from the next room, followed by the characteristic sound of flashbang grenades. Shouts and authoritative commands echoed through the house as federal agents invaded Mrs. Celeste's property. Federal police, everyone on the ground now! The confusion that followed was chaotic. The henchman holding the gun hesitated for an instant, torn between obeying the command or keeping the group under control. That moment of hesitation was all Michael needed. With a quick movement, the journalist launched himself against the man, diverting the gun away from the group. Sarah took advantage of the distraction to pull Mrs. Celeste behind a heavy mahogany cabinet, offering some protection against possible shots. Teresa remained paralyzed, her face a mask of shock and regret. In seconds, the room was filled with armed federal agents. The Colonel's henchmen were quickly subdued and disarmed. Richard Newman himself, the most powerful man in Stone Creek, was now kneeling on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. An agent approached Sarah and Mrs. Celeste. Ladies, are you injured? We're fine, replied Sarah, helping the elderly woman to stand. How did you know? The agent smiled briefly, stepping aside to make way for a familiar figure entering the room. Helen Newman. Sarah felt her jaw drop in surprise. Helen, the Colonel's daughter, the same one who had veiled threatened her days before, now displayed a federal police badge. Agent Helen Montgomery, undercover operation, she introduced herself formally, although a slight smile curved her lips upon noticing Sarah's shock. Or rather, Helen Montgomery. The Colonel is not my biological father. But how? Why? Sarah tried to process the unexpected twist. Helen, or whoever she really was, gestured for them to follow her to a calmer area of the house, while the Colonel and his men were escorted out. I've been investigating Richard Newman for 3 years, she explained when they were in a separate room. Initially, I was assigned to the case after reports of corruption involving public contracts. But we soon discovered something much bigger: money laundering, land grabbing, intimidation, and possible involvement in the disappearance of a young teacher. "Rebecca Lewis," whispered Sarah. Helen nodded gravely. "We needed concrete evidence, something that could definitively bring him down. I infiltrated as his prodigal daughter, claiming to be the fruit of an old relationship and using carefully falsified documents. His vanity did the rest. The colonel was more than willing to believe he had a daughter who had graduated in law abroad." Michael Santana, who had joined them, leaned in with interest. "So the visits to the studio, the veiled threats." "Part of the act," confirmed Helen. "I needed to maintain the facade at all costs. In reality, I was observing you, protecting from afar. When I realized that Mrs. Davis was on the right track, I began to monitor her steps." "But how did you know about this meeting today?" asked Mrs. Celeste, who until then had listened to everything in silence. Helen turned to the door where Teresa remained hesitant, tears streaming down her face. "Teresa contacted us this afternoon. It was she who gave us the exact location and time." Sarah looked at her friend with new understanding. It hadn't been a complete betrayal after all. "I couldn't take it anymore, Sarah," sobbed Teresa, approaching timidly. "He really did buy the hotel debt, threatened my family. I was weak and agreed to inform him about your movements, but after you told me everything today," she wiped her tears with the back of her hand, "I couldn't let him hurt you." "It was Helen who completed the explanation. Teresa went to the police station, but instead of speaking with the local sheriff, she had the sense to ask to speak with someone from outside. One of our agents attended to her, and she told us about the meeting and the colonel's possible intentions." Sarah felt a wave of relief and gratitude. She hugged her friend tightly, silently forgiving her for her momentary weakness. "But there's still something I don't understand," said Sarah, turning to Helen. "The black horse Perseus, how does he fit into all this?" An enigmatic gleam appeared in Helen's eyes. "Ah, Perseus. He was my biggest surprise in this investigation." She smiled slightly. "When I began the operation, I discovered that Rebecca's horse had survived and was being kept secretly by a former farm employee who never believed in the official version of her disappearance. The animal seemed to have a sixth sense for locating clues." "So you used him in the investigation?" asked Michael, fascinated. "Not exactly." Helen seemed to choose her words carefully. "Let's say Perseus had his own agenda. I just facilitated his movements. That animal has an almost supernatural intuition. It was he who found the exact location where Rebecca was buried." A solemn silence fell over the group upon hearing confirmation of what everyone already suspected. "We found her remains last week in a remote area of the Newman farm," continued Helen in a respectful tone. "Forensic analyses confirmed her identity and found sufficient evidence to directly incriminate the colonel and his henchmen. We were just waiting for the right moment to make the arrests." "And what happens now?" asked Mrs. Celeste. "Justice, finally." Helen stood up, adjusting the holster under her blazer. "The colonel will face charges of homicide, corruption, money laundering, and a list of other crimes that will ensure he never again sees the light of day as a free man. His accomplices will also be prosecuted." The next day, the small town of Stone Creek woke to a completely transformed reality. The arrest of Colonel Newman and the discovery of Rebecca Lewis's body were the only topics on the streets, in cafes, and in squares. The empire that the colonel had built over decades was rapidly crumbling as federal investigators unearthed more and more evidence of his crimes. A week later, Sarah was in her studio adjusting the model of a dress when she heard a familiar whinny coming from the street. She approached the window and saw Perseus standing across the street, his black coat gleaming under the afternoon sun. For a moment, the animal's eyes met hers, conveying what Sarah could only describe as gratitude. Beside the horse was Helen, now officially identified as a federal agent. She briefly waved to Sarah before mounting Perseus with surprising elegance. "Where are you going?" asked Sarah, stepping out onto the sidewalk. Helen smiled, caressing the horse's neck. "Perseus is going to a horse sanctuary in the West Virginia countryside. He'll have space, freedom, and lots of care for the rest of his life. And you? Another town, another operation. Helen shrugged. The work never ends. As Perseus began to move away, Sarah had the strange sensation that a part of the story was finally completing itself. The horse turned its head one last time, looking directly at her, and Sarah could swear she saw an almost human gleam in its eyes, as if, for a brief moment, the spirit of Rebecca Lewis was there, finally free to move on in peace. As she watched the two disappear around the bend in the road, Sarah felt a deep sense of conclusion. The dark secrets that Stone Creek had guarded for so long had finally come to light, and justice, albeit late, had arrived for all involved. That night, as she closed her studio, Sarah walked to the old well where it all began. The place seemed different now, lighter, as if an invisible weight had been removed. Looking at the stars that were beginning to dot the sky, she made a silent promise to Rebecca's memory. Her story would not be forgotten. And somewhere distant, perhaps in an open field under the same starry sky, a black horse galloped freely, its mission finally accomplished.